Chapter 49. The Gateway. There was a hallowed feeling about the room beyond the doors. It was strange, the room that must have been locked away from prying eyes for what must have been thousands, if not millions of years, actually carried a sweet rather than a stale or stagnant smell about it. Race hesitated to even place 1 foot across the threshold. The mere idea of doing so almost felt as if it would be an insult to the gods who had built this place. There was a feeling about the room, a kind of divinity, as if everything beyond those huge golden doors was somehow sacred, and that the mere act of placing even a single foot on that floor was like touching the gods themselves. "It's so beautiful," Anita said, "and, do you see, there are no lanterns, no torches. You can see everything just as clear as day." "That's the gods for you," Libna interjected. There was an eager edge to her words. "They create places like this and then shut them away in the heart of a mountain where no one is ever likely to find them." "Well, we found it," Race commented. "The elves found it," Jenni corrected. "We just opened the door." "In all the world," Libna offered, waxing lyrical, "no one else living could have done that. Shall we enter?" Since his first day as a harpy, Race had never felt as naked as he did now. He set 1 foot gingerly across the threshold of the golden doors, as if he was testing the temperature of bath water. The floor was smooth and yet not slippery. It was cool, like marble, and yet it had another quality about it that was hard to name. "Go on," Libna urged, still feeling uncertain about what he was doing, half expecting to be struck down by a divine wrath at any moment. He set his foot firmly on the cool floor of the temple. Nothing happened. There was no thunderclap, no fanfare, nothing to suggest that the gods were even aware of his presence. Race took a deep breath and shifted the weight of his body. Then he placed his 2nd foot on that same hallowed floor next to the first. Now his entire body was inside the temple, with the exception of only a small part of his wings. He looked round nervously at those behind him, half expecting those large golden doors to close behind him and trap him here for the rest of his life. Again, there were no pews for a congregation, no altar at the far end, and there were none of the standard accoutrements that would usually be associated with a place of worship. Nevertheless, the temple felt as if the gods themselves were actually in residence here. This was a place of honour, a place where even a raised voice would feel like a kind of sacrilege. The whole temple seemed to be nothing more than a single large room. There wasn't so much as a single column to support the ceiling, and yet the ceiling remained where it belonged, and didn't even surge under the pressure of what must have been several million tons of rock. Close to the far end of the room was a swirling blue shimmering light. It was nearly large enough to fill the entire width of the room, and seemed to hover in the air unsupported. Between the swirling blue shimmering glow and Race stood dozens and dozens of statues, each of them on their own individual plinths. Far from being in nice neat rows, they were scattered about the room quite haphazardly. Race thought that they looked like marble, but considering the divine nature of this room, they could be made of anything. Every one of the many statues in the room seemed to be that of a harpy. They were evenly distributed between the 2 genders. There were just as many males as there were females. Not one of them had been corrupted by the presence of the humans who had been living above. The eyes of all the statues seemed to be looking straight at Race as he slowly crossed the floor towards them. And though he didn't see it for himself, he had the strongest feeling that they were even moving slowly on their plinths in order to keep their eyes on him at all times. "Strange how their eyes follow you around the room," Jenni commented. "You too," Race replied. "And me," Anita offered. "I almost feel as if they're doing it on purpose." "Divine representations of the gods," Jenni commented. "I tell you, there are gods here that are no longer recognised as part of the usual pantheon. Many of them have long since been forgotten. Yet then I catch sight of a god or goddess who is not only known to me, but who is still depicted at many a chapel exactly as we see them here." "What?" Race turned with a shock towards Jenni. "I've never seen the gods depicted like this before." Jenni looked a little surprised at him. She walked over to one of the statues. It was a statue of a female harpy, and for the briefest of moments Race thought he saw the statue wink at him. He began to wonder if he was letting the divine nature of the room get to him. "What about her?" Jenni asked. "What about her?" Race replied. He looked at the statue in the face again, half waiting, half hoping he would see her wink again, and thus prove he hadn't imagined it the first time. But the statue just stood there, totally immobile. "Come now, Race," Jenni insisted. "This is the goddess of love. She was there exactly as she appears now, watching over you as you and Gagara got married." "You are mistaken," Race replied. "The statue of the goddess of love used at my wedding was human in form." "But," Jenni said, looking up at the statue and then back at Race, "this statue is human." "Jenni," Race replied calmly. That is a statue of a harpy. These are all statues of harpies. They're all human, Anita insisted. It's a trick of the gods, Libna said. It has to be. She laughed. You see the statues as you would expect to see the gods. Race is a harpy, and even though he was brought up in a human society, he sees the gods as harpies. You, Jenny, are human, so you and Anita see them as human. I guess you see them as harpies as well, then, Jenny asked. You could say that, Libna replied. Magic, Jenny commented. Divine magic, Libna replied. Let's move on. I'll admit, Anita commented as they walked through the forest of gods, I was half expecting this place to be trapped. Trapped? Jenny asked. You know, some last-minute tests to wheedle out the unworthy and allow only the purest of heart to proceed to the final test, Anita explained. You read too many fairy tales as a child, Jenny commented. The golden doors were our test, Libna explained. Once Race and Jenny opened the way for us, we proved our worth. Now we just need to open the gateway. And release the dragon, Race added. The sense that the statues were watching him grew as Race proceeded through them to the far end. When he looked back, they still seemed to be looking straight at him. Some of them must have turned a full 180 degrees on their plimps, although Race hadn't actually seen them move so much as an inch. Forget the statues, Libna suggested. They can't hurt you. Let's get to the gateway. The large blue shimmer seemed to be floating in mid-air about 2/3 of the way between the last of the statues and the rearmost wall of the temple. Standing just in front and at the extreme edges of the blue shimmer were another pair of statues. This time the statues appeared to have been made from gold. To Race's eyes, the statue on the left was that of a beautiful female harpy. The beauty of the statue was a challenge even for the loveliness of Gagara. The statue to the right was of a male. Both statues were bent on one knee. In both cases, they were holding their right hand out as if waiting for someone to take it. I see a pair of harpies, Race asked of Jenny. What do you see? I see the goddess of jealousy and the god of strife, Jenny replied. Do they mean anything to you? Race asked. I vaguely recall Mandros teaching me that it was the child of jealousy and strife who created the harpies in the first place. It's all legend, though. Although elves and humans do effectively follow the same gods. Libna smiled and approached the female statue. She looked carefully at the statue and then to Jenny. You need to approach this statue reverently. Get down on one knee, mirroring the statue as close as you can. Then you need to take hold of the hand of the statue in your own. Me? Jenny asked. You, Libna replied. It must be the same two who opened the door, otherwise it simply isn't going to work. Race nodded. So I guess I get the mail. Yes, Libna agreed. Remember to mirror the pose as exactly as you can. Race approached the statue of the harpy god of strife as reverently as he could possibly manage. He stood before the statue, and somehow it felt wrong that currently he stood higher than the god. He knelt down on one leg and reached out to the statue with his right hand, grasping the figure's hand in his own. Nothing happened. No, Libna replied. Mirror the statue. Use your left hand. Both of you, use your left hands. Race swapped hands, taking the statue's right in his left. As he did so, he noticed that Jenny had also swapped hands. It seemed that she had made exactly the same mistake he had. How does she know this stuff? Anita questioned. There was no time for an answer, though. For a moment, there was a chill breeze in the air. Then suddenly a figure seemed to coalesce between the two statues. It was a harpy, as naked as the day she was born, without even so much as a necklace or an earring to adorn her figure. She looked at Race. Then she looked at Jenny, and her body changed subtly and yet immediately to that of a human female, fully clothed in a beautiful and very expensive-looking dress. Then she looked at Race, and once again she was a harpy. I was expecting this, Libna groaned. What? Race asked, his eyes glued to the figure. It's a final plea from the dragon's mother, Libna explained. You mean jealousy? Jenny asked. She glanced briefly round at Libna, and then back at the figure, her eyes wide. But this is the goddess Jealousy? Hello? Race said, uncertain of the proper way to address a goddess. The harpy figure blinked at Race and smiled. Hello, she replied calmly. It had almost been as if she had been waiting for someone to address her, because now she started to speak in fluent flourish. I am known to your people as the goddess of jealousy. It's not a very flattering name. I'd prefer to have been called something like the goddess of hunting, or even the goddess of war. But those names are already taken, and I was stuck with whatever was left. Race tried to speak. The goddess looked at Race and smiled. You are here because you wish to release my daughter from her imprisonment. It's a nice little temple, but not one of the best. You should have seen the one that was built for the child of truth and devotion. Now that's a place worthy of the child of a goddess. Truth and devotion, Race commented uncertainly, but I thought truth was married to love. The goddess looked at Race and gave him a smile that seemed to eat right down into his very soul. Then she said, I have come here to plead with you to rethink your actions. When we locked our children away into their respective pocket universes, we did so for the benefit of you and your kind. This world would be a better place without them, and they are happy enough, each in their own private little playground. Take no notice of her, Libna said. We must release the dragon if we're going to save the human race. The goddess rounded on Libna, and again she smiled. Hello, child. Goddess, Libna replied. She seemed somehow defiant. Do your parents know you're out? The goddess asked. Race glanced round at Libna. He couldn't help thinking that it was a very strange question for a goddess to ask of a harpy. I think so, Libna replied coldly. Of course they do, the goddess replied contentedly. Who let you out? Libna stared at the goddess straight in the eye. The elves did. Yes, the goddess said and nodded. You would have been placed somewhere in the elven lands. No doubt, when you were released, your mother appeared to those who had invaded your temple in much the same way as I've appeared to you now. Wait, Race said, looking at Libna, and then back to the goddess, and then back to Libna. You mean she's... The goddess smiled. I forget, you do not perceive things on quite the same level as I do. Then she sounded demanding. Name yourself, child. Tell your friends who you really are. Libna grinned menacingly. I have gone by many names since I was released. I have travelled from one end of this world to the other. I have even visited civilizations that still think they are alone in this world. Libna paused for a moment and then said, The elves once called me Emperor. That was back when I was a great prophet of their people. The books of Ember are based upon my teachings, although I didn't write them. To the goblins I was known as Crushlock. I was the great chief who melded the 1,000 tribes into a formidable force capable of withstanding the might of the newly created Elven Empire. For the Harpies I took the name Lamawort the Eternal. I was the only Harpy in history that could actually cast magic. She grinned at Race. I'm sorry if I made you think otherwise, but you are not the reincarnation of me. You were Lamawort, Jenni said, startled. But, Race interjected, I know magic. Harpies can't use magic, Libna explained, talking to Race in an almost patronising tone. It's simply not in your genetic makeup. The only reason you could make use of magic was because I gave you that ability. Way back when you were born, I could see your life leading inexorably to this day. I foresaw that if you were to survive to this day, you would need every advantage I could give you. It is an advantage I no longer need you to have, and so I take it from you. Race summoned the sword from his hammerstone ring and stood up, approaching the dragon threateningly. Race, Jenni hissed, not in front of the goddess. Race calmed down a little. He returned the weapon to the hammerstone. Don't worry, Libna replied. His sword would not even scratch me. She grinned. That reminds me, before I became Libna, I was posing as an elven mage by the name of Darty. One of my loyal officers gave me a sword. I believe it belongs to you. You were Darty? Race accused. Yes. Libna's form changed, and a mere second later Darty was standing where Libna had been. The voice changed too, becoming much more masculine. It became necessary for me to change my identity after I killed the Emperor. I no longer had any use for him, and he was beginning to ask too many questions about what I was doing in Arlis, Darty explained. The sword Race had once carried into Goldspawn appeared suddenly in the mage's hand. Who are you, child? The goddess insisted. Who are your parents? Death and hate, Jenni commented, glaring at Libna. They have to be. I should have guessed, Anita commented. Everything about her was too perfect. The way she led us here, taking exactly the right passage each time. The way she seemed to understand what was required to open the door. It was all too good. Libna, Darty, or the son of Death and Hate as he was known, offered the sword to Race. Race refused to take it. Death and Hate, the goddess said. I once considered having a fling with Hate, but he preferred the company of his wife. Can you believe it? He turned me down. I believe it, Death and Hate replied snidely. The goddess tilted her head to the side in a way that made her look even more like the harpy form she had taken. You always were an evil little brat. Never happy with what you were given? Always trying to cause trouble among your siblings? Part of the reason you were cast into your own little pocket universes was because you just didn't know how to get on with others. Look who's talking, jealousy, Death and Hate replied. And now you've started a war, all to suit your own ends. How many thousands have already died because of you? How many more thousands will die before the day is out? You see why I say you should leave my daughter alone. If one alone can cause so much chaos, think what it would be like having two of them at large. I would destroy the world if it meant releasing my siblings from their unwarranted prisons. I warn you now, jealousy. I have been all over the world. I know where the others are being held, and I know how to release them. We are coming back, and we are coming back in strength. Then you have learnt nothing, the goddess retorted, and without a sound she vanished. As the goddess vanished, the left arm on each of the two statues climbed to a position where they too could be easily grasped. Now, take their left hands in your right, Hate instructed. Race gave the dragon a strange look. Did he really think they were going to obey him now, considering what had just been revealed? Klemper was your student, wasn't he? Jenni said. She climbed to her feet. You were the one responsible for the slaughter of my parents. I ordered Klemper to take First Town, Hate admitted. I didn't tell him to kill your parents, that was his idea. I could have used the slaves, but he had orders to slaughter anyone who might have been able to mount a reasonable defence, Race accused. Well, yes, Hate admitted. It was war. War, Race accused. Why start a war? It was the only way, Hate replied. I couldn't just approach the Duke of Arles and request permission to enslave the population of his city in order to remove that city and uncover a path to a temple. It had to be war. Especially after my plan to replace the baby Duke of Arles with a changeling was foiled. So, you manipulated the elves into fighting a war for you, Jenni started. You cost me the lives of my parents and both my blood-related brothers. And my father, Anita put in angrily. Don't forget my father. Manipulated, Hate commented. Yes, that's a good word. I have been manipulating you since before you were born, she looked at Race. The only reason your mother didn't smash your head out on a rock the day you were born was because I visited both her and her friend in a dream the night before and suggested that she should drown you instead. I knew she would fail, and I also knew that Jenni and Tia would be along at any moment to rescue you. I knew that if Jenni hadn't been one of those who found you, you would have been killed instantly with most of the rest of your village. What was your village even doing in Damoth? Guess who put the idea into the mind of the village's leader? Then there's Kagara. Isn't it a strange coincidence that you should just happen to meet her within 2 hours of entering the Elven City? If I hadn't put the two of you together, you would have been dead before nightfall, killed in the middle of a street by one of the many village harpies who also happened to be living there. Your killer would have died fighting her 7th bout in the arena about 6 months later, but your death wouldn't have suited my plans one whit. You put Kagara and me together, Ray said doubtfully. I also saved her life, Hate replied, visiting you in a dream and warning you what would happen if you fought at Castle Damoth. So you say, Ray said, that he wasn't sure the dragon was lying. I also saved your life, he said, pointing to Jenni. I visited you the night before the harpies attacked your carriage and warned you not to fight. Had you fought, you and your husband would be dead. Perhaps, Jenni commented uncertainly. And who do you think arranged it for you to keep your ring in the arena? Hate added, turning his attention back to Race. But you only did so because you needed us alive to open your precious gateway, Jenni added. Hate grinned at Jenni and then said, There's one thing I do know, Race. One thing that even I cannot change. You and your sister are so totally intertwined that when one of you dies, the other will have a week, at most, to live. Race looked across at Jenni. As a harpy, he would die in his late 20s, maybe his early 30s, if he was lucky. By then, Jenni would only be in her early 40s, and still quite young for a human. Now, Hate said, open the way. Let my sister out. No, Race replied, your sister remains put. He looked across at Jenni for moral support. Jenni nodded. Now we know what you are and what you've done. How can you ever imagine we would help you? Hate grinned. I expected this. I can't force you to open the gate. I need you to do so willingly. Suddenly, a large image of the battle being fought above them appeared on a nearby wall. The battle was going badly. King Goti, his knights, cavalry, and maybe a couple of 100 men-at-arms were tracked. They were surrounded by thousands of elven foes, whose one aim seemed to be to wipe out those inside the pocket. Kagara was also with the king, using her claws like a creature possessed. Hate looked at Jenni. Your husband looks well. Then he turned to Race, adding, As does your wife. But they are few in number, and they are cut off from the rest of their army. How long do you suppose they'll last without help? Race examined the image closely. Kagara was wounded. There was an arrow protruding from one of her wings. It wasn't a bad wound, but it was enough to keep her grounded. Elsewhere on the battlefield, the rest of the king's army, the men-at-arms, archers and peasants, were putting up a brave fight. But as hard as they tried, they were unable to get through to rescue their king or his knights. If anything, they were being pushed further back. This is not my doing, it's simply the way the battle was always destined to go. At this moment, both of your spouses are still alive, Deafenhate pointed out. But for how much longer? There is only one way you can save them. Use the wish, Anita muttered. Release my sister, Deafenhate instructed, and use the wish. Race nodded. Feeling helpless, he looked across at Jenni. Then he looked back at the image. They had to hurry. They didn't have a lot of time to ponder the ramifications of what they were doing. The knights were good, but even they couldn't stand against such opposition forever. Jenni nodded back at Race. He watched her as she took her position next to the Statue of Jealousy. Race dropped to one knee. Then he grasped hold of the hand of the Statue of Strife. Now, Deafenhate said eagerly, release my sister.